It's Ivy Slater, and you're listening to Her Success Story podcast, a show where gutsy businesswomen share their success journey. Hi, this is Ivy Slater. Welcome to today's episode of Her Success Story. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with a friend, a colleague, a fellow networker. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Erin Anderson, the CEO and founder of Your Brand Networker, who is currently based in New York City and is proud to say she's a native New Yorker. Erin has built a business that's all focused around LinkedIn, using it as a career transition. She's a career transition coach, a LinkedIn marketing strategist, and speaker. She focuses her working with career professionals with transitioning across industries or out of toxic work culture, which she is very passionate about. She also works with small business owners and career professionals in their LinkedIn strategy. Erin, as I call you Miss LinkedIn, welcome and thanks for joining me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So let's kick this off. How did you become a business owner? You know, you're on the career path. You have a strong career in the background with a major trajectory of scaling up, staying in corporate America. What caused you to jump and open a business?
Yeah, so it's funny, when I was getting my master's in business school, there was an entrepreneurship route, and I kind of laughed at it when I had to check the box of what I wanted to do, I think I always associated the word entrepreneur, A, with a male, and B, not really recognizing, as I think many of us do before we start our own businesses, that an entrepreneur is the same thing as a small business owner. I used to think of those two things separately, even after finishing business school. And so there was barely any of us that took the entrepreneurship route. I chose finance at the time because that's just what I was doing really well in. And I've always been taught whatever you do well in, you'll likely like, because you're going to be good at it and you're going to do the job that needs to get done. So I was excelling in finance and accounting, and I figured, although I was an English major undergrad, this is the route I was going to go. Started a career in corporate banking and hit severe toxic work culture. And so that's really how I got started, because my first one was verbal, went through a couple of years there, and then the next one being sexual, and me finally taking the stand to leave. Leaving a few months before the pandemic hit. So then I was in the final stages of interviews during a pandemic, actually interviewing as schools were shutting down around us and being uncomfortable in an interview, and then having to recognize a hiring freeze and go on unemployment. And I'm very type A and don't like sitting at home. While other people are probably taking advantage of the higher unemployment, I was sitting there figuring out what else I could do with it. And so I started, just next year will be 2 months exactly that I started very slowly trying to vamp it up, thinking it was going to be a side gig when everything opened up again. And it took off because in 2020, people were not only out of work, they were looking to transition. They had more time to recognize what they didn't like in their current careers. And that has led me to continuing.
So was it an interesting thing? So as we all transitioned working from home as opposed to office, did that shift toxic work culture or not?
Yeah, good question. I think for some companies, it actually took companies that were performing at a really high level in terms of culture and engagement to the opposite side, because now you had access to your employees 24/7. People, in a way, employees almost contributed to it because they weren't putting boundaries on themselves. And so they were finding that, oh, there's another Slack message. And then they were putting the Slack up on their phone. And now they have everything came onto their phone. And so work never really ended. And then you can't blame them for it, right? Because depending on if they were in an apartment or a home, we didn't have access to go to these community workplaces anymore. So we were never really leaving our work environment. And in addition to that, you had already existing micromanagers or maybe people that had the tendency with that behavior to take advantage of these situations. And so it definitely excelled for some companies. And I think now looking back 2 years later, it's almost like we had to go through the struggles to come out on the other side now, where it got so bad that companies had to recognize it because people had their resources and were attending webinars and all this awareness, or they had burnout from having struggles to balance their business, their family, their career. How were they going to do it? And now we're in an entire different period where people are transitioning and companies are being forced to increase salary because it's going to go public soon. And it's interesting how similar to entrepreneurship or in your career, how sometimes you have to, at those stages where you're saying, why me, later on, there's a reason for it.
And so when we look at LinkedIn, okay, I find it so interesting as I've gotten to know you over the last couple of years, to understand how your network, you're helping people transition careers as well as you're helping small business. And building a business, they're always like niche, the riches are in the niches. And your niche is LinkedIn, but you cover several different areas. Does this drive you crazy or does it complement?
Compliments, because they all overlap, right? I work with both females and males, but especially with females, they tend to gravitate towards a side gig or starting a business, or they always have the same, they have this idea, or if I'm going to start to have kids and take time off, how can I start a business? How do I grow it? How do I market it? How do I look like an expert in my industry, both in my career and in my business? And how do I tie those together? And that's something I work with a lot of people on, because they'll come to me and they'll say, I'm worried about my company thinking that I'm engaging too much in my business on LinkedIn. And the first question I ask is, does your company know about your business? Because usually you have to sign a conflict of interest form if you're doing that, like I've had to do. And if they do, and they say they highly support it, then I say, well, you should really start building on LinkedIn, because you're probably not using it too much on the career side. But what you're doing in your business and your career probably mesh together in some way. And so now you're forming an image of how you are the best expert in what you do on the platform.
So do you, so you find clients that sometimes come to you for the career transition who have a side gig, and then you help them in their business and developing LinkedIn. And then people who come to you on the side gig business and then work with you on career transition and using LinkedIn to help navigate that.
Yes.
So when we're looking for what do our listeners, as her success story cultivates so many great leaders in the sense of people leading businesses, even a lot of people leading major careers in leadership, how do we, the layman who basically functions, I will say, almost dangerously with LinkedIn?
Mm-hmm.
Most of us are, and I'll throw myself right under this bus, are so dangerous because we have no idea what we're doing, but we think we do. Mm-hmm. And you said something when I've spoken to you previously, like, oh yeah, they kind of reached out to me, but I didn't see it. So explain a little bit of some of the things like the good old fashioned layman should know and can know about navigating LinkedIn smartly.
Yes. So one of the biggest issues I see is people decide that they really need to send a message to somebody on LinkedIn without connecting to them first. And what happens is this goes to somebody's email folder. So I don't necessarily want to compare it to a spam folder on email, but I would say it would be the equivalent of maybe ending up in promotions on Gmail, where maybe sometimes you check it, you don't, it could appear as an ad. And so you might not ever get to that potential client that's reaching out to you. Or if you're pitching yourself or trying to make an introduction or inviting somebody to something, they may never see it. And so the whole point of LinkedIn is to connect. And so I always encourage, before you're actually sending a message to somebody that you're looking to connect with in some way, connect with them first. And then once they accept, then send them the message, because what will happen is it will go to the top of the inbox. And then there's no chance that person's going to miss it at that point. That's number one. I would say number two is I see a lot of people not creating content that responds to what their audience wants. And so they're not creating content that's relatable. And so when they hop on LinkedIn, they're only think of their ideal client. But the power of LinkedIn is the more views, comments, and likes there are, anybody that's liking that content is actually boosting our views and our visibility on the platform. So it's really not just always speaking to entrepreneurs or not just speaking to career professionals, depending on what you do or the company. It's how can I formulate a post with a call to action that is for my ideal client, but the beginning relates to everybody so that everybody will be encouraged to engage in it. That's what really works on LinkedIn, something that everybody can relate to in some way.
And it's interesting because I'm visually, as you're chatting, like in my head looking at my LinkedIn, and it's like, gee, you know what? Like we post regularly, I post regularly, my team posts regularly. We're pretty active on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. We do a LinkedIn live show, etc. And what's really interesting is I will say one of the posts that I got the most traction on recently was I bought myself a new notebook at Barnes and Noble. And I thought it was so beautiful that I couldn't resist it off the shelf. And I posted about it. And I would say the cover of the notebook and the conversation around that got some of the biggest reach I've ever gotten.
Mm-hmm. Right. Because everybody wants the notebook. Everybody can relate. Everyone can relate to at some point when they've been in a store and they can't resist a purchase. There's so many angles that people can find it, because it's not just about the notebook. It's about not being able to resist a purchase or going for something that we like or have a passion for. And what's interesting is people will take that in those different directions. And then that starts a conversation. And now it's no longer just about the notebook. It's about the feelings around the notebook. And it's so fascinating to see how people, different people's perspectives on what we post.
So speaking of feelings, toxic work culture, unfortunately, it's been around a very long time. Mm-hmm. And I know I've been there in my early years before I started running a business. Mm-hmm. It's not always an easy thing to navigate. When you're working with clients and helping them create their strategy of their next moves, mm-hmm. how can you work with them to see that there's places that are not like the previous?
Yeah.
And I'm not quite sure if that's even making sense. But yeah, we hold on to that limit when we have an experience. Mm-hmm. I'll say this a little better. When we have an experience, mm-hmm. until we see that experience is not going to repeat itself, that it was a one-off, right, or a two, right? Or unfortunately for you, is a two, that there's other potential out there that is not like that experience. Yeah. It's hard to believe.
Correct.
How do you help your clients get there to take the actions and moving forward?
Yeah. So there's a few things here. I would say first, it's diving into a little bit of imposter syndrome, because at this point, they're probably coming out of a culture and a management situation, or maybe a coworker situation where they've been, degraded down to nothing, and they feel like they're not worthy and that they can't excel. And then we dive into more of what they like, because even if starting off, they loved what they did in that industry, sometimes we associate experiences. And so they will no longer like what they're doing, actually, when we get down to the bottom of that. And then the third thing is talking about how can we explore other industries that are best for our skill set. And then I give examples and stories of other clients that have done the same, and encourage people to do their research, because sometimes people can't believe, wow, people can transition from marketing to finance with a general business degree. And I think people when they come to me, they think, okay, I need an MBA and I need to spend $200,000 in education, or I need this certification, forgetting about how many free resources there are out there. And it's not always about paying for it. It's how can you show that you took the initiative to have an expertise? How can you show that you, during your time off or while you stayed home with the kids, that you still did something for your personal development that contributed to how you're going to make that transition? I think that's the first step, is showing resources and stories, because people first have to believe in themselves that they can do it. And then once they realize it, okay, now what do you like? What are you good at? Because maybe what you were doing it all before was somewhat contributing to why you didn't like the place that you worked at. Obviously not dismissing the toxic work culture, but trying to figure out, was it just the toxic work culture? Because we, as humans, associate experiences. So,
right. So what I'm hearing is you really help your clients drill down
to
what's in their heart, and then create that strategy to move forward and achieve it.
Yes, exactly.
Erin, how can our listeners learn more about you, follow you, obviously reach out to you on LinkedIn?
Yeah, for sure. So on every platform, I'm just at Your Brand Networker, not the LLC, just Your Brand Networker. And you can come follow me on LinkedIn. I create a lot of content around toxic work culture and transition. And on Instagram, I talk a little bit more about LinkedIn because most people on Instagram aren't on LinkedIn yet. So on either platform, you can get tips on both.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for being here. And listeners, thank you for joining us here today. You can find all more information about Erin in the bio below, as well as here's a couple of things that I say that are incredibly important. So open both ears, please. Stop and think about what you listened to today. What was your biggest takeaway from it? And feel free to put in the notes below your takeaway and what the action you're committing to that will help you move forward. We're here to support and have everybody be as successful as they choose to be. Remember to hit subscribe if you like today's episode, share that forward with a friend, and have other people listen to Erin's advice and strategy to move forward. Erin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Remember to stay tuned to Her Success Story, hitting your inbox every Monday morning. See you next time.